A plane carrying European President Ursula von der Leyen was targeted by Russian GPS jamming. Just why are the Russians going after the EU president? And is the media and EU already downplaying what's really going on? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Slap that subscribe button, guys. By the way, also, if you want access to exclusive uncensored combat footage and other videos, become a member at combatvetnews.com and support the channel and my independent reporting. Now, this is a crazy story that I'm shocked is actually being covered as anemically as it is, because well, here's the contours of it. The GPS system of the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, her aircraft was jammed on Sunday while en route to Bulgaria, right? Now, it landed safely, to be clear. But what's more troubling is that the spokesman for the president said, quote, "We can confirm that there was GPS jamming." Now, this alone is already a huge flag from the Europeans, where, again, normally, even when they know it's Russian intelligence, they'll sometimes be coy. They'll say, well, there was GPS interference. They'll say something that could be interpreted either way. And that seems to often be done either to avoid panicking the European public, so that the European public never understands the level of involvement of the Russian state in these kind of attacks, and to avoid, well, frankly, kind of humiliating the Europeans, because, well, again, imagine if the Russians were able to jam the GPS of a Air Force One, right? We'd say, wow, the Air Force One sort of sucks. So the fact that they're willing to admit that, yeah, their president was extremely vulnerable and at the same time was also targeted by an electronic attack by the Russian authorities. But here's what I want you guys to understand here, right? The plane reportedly had to circle for nearly an hour while it attempted to, the pilots had to take over and land the plane using paper maps and paper charts. And remember, this GPS signal loss was reportedly not targeted to the aircraft specifically, but to the larger airport area, meaning that it wasn't a side effect of this was actually blinding the GPS of all approaching aircraft to the airport. Now, so this could have just as easily killed the European president as it could have killed any innocent bystanders flying around. And this is the thing I want you guys to take away from this, that I take away from it, that we should contextualize it appropriately. Okay. If I were to, this is the equivalent, right? Aircraft flying via GPS. This is the equivalent of me taking like a sunshade or a huge blue tarp and suddenly throwing it across your windshield. Can you still drive the car? Yeah, but you can't really see where you're going. And technically you could roll down the window and lean your head out and still manage to navigate safely. But it's hard, right? And that's why this aircraft had to simply sit there circling for an hour. And if the Russians had timed it better, for example, as the aircraft was on approach, it could have been a disaster. And the Russians know this. They know that by suddenly blinding all of the aircraft in a certain airspace, that they are creating an environment in which, yeah, they could have successfully killed the European president, which would have been well, I'd say it would have been a diplomatic disaster, but the way Europe engages with Russia at this point, I think the Europeans would have just pretended it was a little whoopsie daisy. But they also could have killed any number of civilians and who would simply be casualties of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the fact is that if I threw up, again, a tarp over your windshield while you were on the middle of the highway, you would be like, damn, you tried to kill me. But somehow, inexplicably, blinding the aircraft of the European president is not being framed or reported as what it is, which is an attempt on the president's life. And I want the takeaway from this to be, again, when you hear individuals, particularly coming from the White House, describe Russia as being someone who is highly interested in peace, I want you to ask yourself, are these the actions of a peaceful country, right? Again, the Bulgarian authorities are like this. We suspect this is due to interference by Russia. But again, Baltic countries for months have been reporting on GPS signal jamming operations happening to aviators and mariners in the region that basically began when Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, the thing to take away, remember, is that Russia doesn't use GPS. It sometimes does when it buys commercial off-the-shelf technology, but they rely on something called GLONASS, which is a less accurate version, but it's entirely controlled by the Russian military. They have their own network of satellites that are essentially a GPS clone. And so for Russia, they often find it advantageous to jam GPS signals because their aircraft and their munitions can still guide themselves to target. But the most important thing to take away from here is that this has been a systematic effort by the Russian government. 8 European countries, for example, this was in March, like Finland, Poland, France, the Netherlands, and Ukraine, lodged a complaint with the UN about this practice. Several UN agencies have taken up the issue. And Russia, claims this is not, it says it doesn't happen. It makes no comments on any of this. But open source data, of course, indicates that these jamming signals come from one place, which is Kaliningrad, a Russian sovereign territory sort of situated near the Baltics. It's a Russian enclave between Poland and Lithuania. And it's pretty well known that these regions, of course, have electronic warfare and radio technologies meant to both intercept the radio communications of Baltic countries and to, do stuff like this. But as one person points out, one analyst points out in this article, it's actually not technically that hard to interfere with GPS signals. It's not that technically sophisticated, but the problem is not, again, that it's hard. It's that the Russians would only do these sorts of actions if they believed that they were, inflicting damage on an enemy. And so when you sit there and go, Putin's ready for peace, Putin wants peace, and it's these pesky Ukrainians that are the problem. But I know that the Ukrainians have not engaged in this GPS signal jamming operations. And the Baltic countries, when you look, they're nowhere near any of the combat zones. And so this idea that this could just be like a side effect of combat operations is pretty preposterous, right? You see that even when Ukraine launches drone strikes, they're hardly ever anywhere near the Bulgarian border, right? So you have to really the actions are what we need to judge the Russian state against. And that is the core issue here, is that if somebody tells you that Russia really wants peace, I think that's technically true, but it's true in the sense that Russia wants the peace of victory, right? They say, yeah, we want peace. We want a Ukraine that just stops resisting and just accepts Russian domination. And technically that's true. Ukraine in that sense is an obstacle to peace because they have these pesky ideas that they want to be a free and independent country. But when you look around and you say, okay, who is sincerely moving towards a peaceful resolution of this conflict? You can't argue that Vladimir Putin, whatever he says, as long as he takes actions like this, again, attempting to literally kill the president of the European Commission, you probably can't really sincerely argue that this is Mr. Peaceful here. And as I've said repeatedly on this channel, the question is not, will we get all these countries to get along? Because again, assassination attempt, basically. The question is the Western world and Western democracies going to wake up to the threat that autocratic countries are posing? And are they going to win, right? Because right now, again, every time Russia does these kind of actions, which, by the way, anyone who tells you that, if we help Ukraine too much, it might be escalatory. But to Russia, crashing the plane of the president of the European Commission was not seen as escalatory. Let that sink in. Vladimir Putin didn't view this act as being problematically escalatory because he correctly identified that the Europeans would do nothing. They would take it, right? Because that has been the European MO. That is to simply pretend that your enemies don't exist and that your enemies aren't really operating and don't really have designs on your country. But when you do that, when you pretend that threats don't exist, you're not smart, you're naive. It's like it's like living in a super high crime area and just leaving your doors unlocked. You can get away with it for a while, but at some point you're going to have to face the consequences. And again, if the timing was slightly different on this, the European Commission would have had to confront the reality that their president was killed by a Russian electronic warfare attack. And the sad part is either the Europeans, I mean, they may lack both the political will, the institutional organization, and the literal infrastructure, given that their militaries are tiny fractions of the size of the Russian military. Given that reality, they may simply not be able to respond, right? Playing dead may literally be the only option available to the entirety of Western Europe, which is, again, kind of insane, but that is what happens when you fail to invest in your defense infrastructure for 30 plus years. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Hit that subscribe button. Thanks to folks like Sergey Zinchenko, D. Stewart, James Porsche, B. Hammerling, and all of our lieutenant tier members. Join me over there. I hope you appreciated it. Have a good Labor Day. See you in the next one. Cheers.